An FX EFP, or exchange for physical, involves simultaneous transactions in the cash and futures markets. An EFP is one type of ex-pit transaction that is allowed to take place outside of the central limit order book under Rule 538. Let's consider an example of an FX EFP. Assume a hedge fund is long 125 million euro/US dollar FX spot in the OTC FX market and is considering booking a swap to give themselves a forward exposure he needs for his portfolio. But the hedge fund is concerned about the counterparty's credit risk going forward. One way to mitigate this risk is to utilize futures contracts that are centrally cleared and collateralized. In this case, the prospective OTC FX Euro/US dollar position can easily be replicated using Euro/US dollar futures. To initiate the transaction, the hedge fund contacts his broker to find another counterparty to execute an FX cash versus futures trade, EFP. Instead of executing an OTC swap, the hedge fund wants to sell his Euro/US dollar FX spot position and buy an equivalent position in the Euro/US dollar FX futures for a forward date. The broker confirms the agreement. The hedge fund trader writes up his side of the transaction. This consists of two parts: the sell of the cash side for 125 million Euro/US dollar FX spot, and the buy side of the futures is 1,000 Euro/US dollar FX contracts. Why 1,000 futures contracts? 1 Euro/US dollar FX futures contract has an equivalent notional value of 125,000 euros. By dividing the futures contract's notional value into the existing risk position of 125 million OTC Euro/US dollars, the result is 1,000 equivalent futures contracts. The broker writes up the counterparty side of the transaction, which is buying 125 million Euro/US dollar FX OTC spot and selling 1,000 Euro/US dollar FX futures. Both parties report their side of the transaction to their respective clearing firms, which in turn submit each trade to the clearing house. Once the trades are submitted to the clearing house, the long futures position reside in the book of the hedge fund and the short position on the broker's customer account. The transaction is complete, and these new futures positions are just like any other open futures positions. They are subject to margining and can be offset at any time. The hedge fund now has the forward Euro/US dollar position exposure it wants and has also mitigated counterparty credit risk by using centrally cleared Euro/US dollar FX futures. Let's consider another example of an FX EFP transaction. This time, let's assume there is a commodity trading advisor, also known as a CTA. CTAs manage money for their customers. The CTA sees depth and liquidity in the FX OTC market and decides to negotiate a 50 million Aussie US dollar OTC FX spot trade on behalf of his accounts under management. But instead of booking an OTC FX swap to move their exposure forward, the CTA immediately thereafter decides to convert the OTC exposure to futures. The CTA and the counterparty decide to negotiate and execute an EFP, whereby the quantity of the 50 million Aussie US dollar OTC spot originally executed would cancel out with the 50 million Aussie US dollar OTC spot for the EFP. The accounts under management would be left with Aussie US dollar futures. In this scenario, because it is an immediately offsetting FX EFP executed by a CTA, the initiating and offsetting cash legs are not required to be passed through the customer who received the exchange contract as part of the EFRP. However, in a circumstance where the futures leg of the transaction fails to clear, the underlying accounts under management must receive the profit or loss of the offsetting cash leg. There you have it, EFPs, an efficient way for market participants to simultaneously transact in both the cash and futures markets.